checking in the morning of what feels to be the most high stress environment that I've ever experienced in my life, which is kind of a weird thing. It's weird in that it's hard to really define stress as a concept. On the whole, stress is something that you can internalize, but a true definition is slightly more difficult to come by. The way I feel is pressured, pressed, put up against something that I'm not sure if I could physically survive through, even though it is a situation in which I have put myself on purpose, and I know I'm not in actually any mortal danger. I feel stressed nonetheless. It feels like they are to truly live, because a rational person could argue that it's unreasonable that people can go about their daily lives as vulnerable as we are and not feel constantly stressed, constantly anxious, constantly worried, constantly feeling like, upset, just generally upset. People strive not even for a generally good feeling these days. They just strive for not feeling bad. They would prefer to feel neutral, and I can understand that. But neutral, to me, is quite a taxing feeling. Neutral makes me feel anxious, because I feel like there's nothing changing. And if there's nothing changing, it's hard to monitor growth. But I think that this is just an observational flaw. I don't think it's anything that is inherently predisposing to a specific way or feel. I think that it is just the way that I have been internalizing things. And I think that after careful consideration and re-examining of the way I've lived my life, I will come out of this event a stronger person, one way or the other, whether this is the thing that I should be doing or not. I feel this test is a necessary test for everyone in my life, because I am a necessary functioning part of a society. Well, at least I should be, and I want to be. But how do you function in a society? Well, usually you're tasked with a specific thing to do, to provide. Well, not necessarily. You will usually end up finding your own niche somewhere along the lines. People didn't tell the beaver trappers to be beaver trappers, I don't think, unless they were the second generation of them. But the first ones were innovators of their times, and I hope to be an innovator at some point. You could argue that what I am doing is innovative, but I'm not sure how much I agree. Perhaps because I'm only my own harshest critic, but looking upon the events of my life, I've lived both a very full and a very empty life. This goes back to a previous point that I was trying to state, that a being is not necessarily a thesis or an antithesis so much as a synthesis. I am a mixture of all the events that have ever happened upon me. And lately I've been wanting to be the architect of my own future, and trying to go from a very passive way of viewing the world to an active way of viewing the world is not only terrifying and harrowing, but it's something that is often considered either heroic or why the number 3 makes so much sense to so many situations and so many people. because there must always be at least 3 points to establish a true understanding of a real object. This is just basic geometry. 2 points make a line, and 3 points make a shape, at least 3. And then, if we expound upon this theory, we could theoretically, well, that's a bit redundant, but we could apply it to the real world. Since, by and large, the only difference between thinking and the world is action. Dreams often sit by the wayside because the dreamer believes that they cannot. And then some dreamers overcome that fear, that innate, irrational voice. Or you could say it's the rational one, I guess. But where does rationale come from? Rationale is meant to be an evolutionary trait to keep you in line, to keep you able to coexist with your peers, to exist in society, as it were. But these days, more and more people are buying into their own fears, their biases, thinking that it's only fine for them to exist outside of society because they are the authors of their own lifetime, their own story. This allows them to say, well, I don't owe society anything and it doesn't owe me anything, therefore I can exist outside of society. But then they don't actually exist outside of society, it's just perceived that way. These people end up becoming leeches. These people are only able to further themselves insofar as other people will allow them to go. These people are the people that I tend to attract, but in a way, I think there's a part of me that is also very similar to them. I seek somebody, or multiple somebodies, to join with me on a heroic journey. This heroic journey would entail examining our belief structure, our understanding of reality, our very being, and theoretically being able to expand all of these things for the good of each other, for the good of mankind, for the good of society, and for, hopefully, the betterment of humanity as a whole. Several years ago, the things that we do now would have been considered impossible. And right now, there are several things that are impossible, that are deemed impossible, I believe, that I wish to incorporate. I wish to expound upon. I wish to elucidate. I wish to prove the impossible possible. Now, how does one go about this? You discover something that either nobody has discovered, or think about it in a way that nobody else has thought about it. Uniquity. How does one get uniquity? Well, each human has their own set of agency. This agency, when driven to where it is actually intended to go, tends towards uniquity, as each human is its own unique strata of biological components comprised of organs, molecules, bacteria. There are those who say that there is a second brain in the stomach, in the phytonutrients and the bacteria that your body uses to continue existing. There is a certain genius in that, as literally you are what you eat in that situation, and literally you do become what your nutrients are that you ingest. So, We need to stop eating so much garbage. Anyway, I have a theory that I want to work on, and I will probably end up turning this writing prompt into a standard, a place where I can continue my research. The research that had been lost and forgotten years ago, but recently, due to several people's assistance in ways both conscious and unconscious, I've been able to return back to the track that I had been set off upon 7+ years ago, so that I may continue my experimentation, my thesis, my wavelength theory, as it were. It probably won't make very much sense until it's done to a lot of people, because my mind works in a very strange way. My cat works in a very strange way. Yes. So what I would like to relate is that the first things first, we need to establish basic guidelines and boundaries, basic principles, basic standings. So I guess this would be chapter 0 or chapter 1, depending on where your matrix is oriented, depending on which set of values you believe in. It's the difference between having ground floor and then first floor, or the first floor is the ground floor. It's just rationalizations differ from place to place. I would like to establish the very basic understanding that we all share. Humankind all perceives the world. Therefore, we all have very slightly altered perceptions of the world. These altered perceptions are altered through the states of chemicals that go through our brains, typically. So, each individual has a unique concoction of chemicals that makes them who they are, makes them react the ways they do. If we were to examine these chemicals, we could then have a causal interaction between the way people react. You could see and hear the differences between human beings, the subtle differences between the left side and the right side of something, the subtle nuance between the shifting leg slamming into the table, interrupting what I'm trying to say. The subtle nuance being able to hopefully eventually lead to remembering more, using the so-called cliff notes that I leave for myself in my memory to more or less expound upon what my perception of reality is and what everyone's perception of their version of reality is, so then we can communicate feeling more appropriately, so that people are able to fully, actually, rationally articulate what they mean to say, so that people can communicate at a basically more universal wavelength. That's why I call it wavelength theory. So, if you're to view a human brain as if it were a radio, and the chemicals in the human brain as the different modules on the front of the radio, what are the things that you do to a radio? Well, you have frequency, amplitude, and you modulate them. And that's the effect on the wave itself, as it were. The chemicals that are in the human brain are the things that are causing these to happen. Well, what happens if you have a different human brain that doesn't necessarily react the same as another? Well, you would have what is typically referred to as a chemical imbalance in the brain, which is, by and large, what psychology is hoping to try and fix. Well, this science is still largely in need of assistance in that there's no necessarily guaranteed ways of doing many things. Like consciousness is something that we don't have perfectly nailed down yet. And then altered states of being. There are people that fully sober have an altered state of being that would lend them to be more similar to somebody on specific types of drugs. Those people might then connect on a particular wavelength, and then we could use them as 2 points. And they have the ability to share their experiences of a specific phenomena. And if they're able to both communicate on the same wavelength, we would be able to get multiple perspectives on that phenomena. And then we would have not only the objective version of reality that we record on a daily basis, but also the subjective version of reality that could then also be recorded on a daily basis. So that instead of it having to be a book that's written and you are meant to imagine how that feels, I don't think it's fair to have massive atrocities throughout history and everyone is expected to react to them the same way. I, as a child in history class, nearly slept through the lectures because I was bored to tears, because at the time, not only did I not care, but I also had teachers that would go specifically making you memorize the dates. And I have slight dyscalculia, so I have an innate problem with keeping numbers in their right order. I've learned since to overcome this, but the outstanding feeling that history is something that is beyond my comprehension lingers. However, I know this as one of my weaknesses and will work on it in the future. One step at a time, mind you. I have multiple weaknesses, and I'm working on them each individually in bite-sized pieces so that they'll be manageable and I won't just give up, because I'm tired of giving up. I'm tired of making progress and then throwing it away. I'm tired of living in a world where I feel dissatisfied because I'm not allowing myself to be who and what I want to be. I know that this thesis is currently my strongest motivating factor. Primarily, I say that. It's hard to internalize that for me personally, also, because there are things that I have been more passionate about in my life, and there are currently things that I am more passionate about, but they're not as concurrent, and they're not as unique to me. They are situations outside of my being that I cannot control, and I need to take the reins where I can control them, and stop trying to assume that I can control things that I cannot. Therefore, this thesis must be the thing that I redefine, refine, and establish moving forward, so that I, and hopefully everyone I know, may strive for a more correct, applicable, a more reasonable version of understanding one another, a more reasonable humanity, a humanity where people are able to communicate properly all the time, every human, no matter what problems lie between them, no matter what dysfunctions lie between them. A person who is in hospice care, a person who is paraplegic, a person who is on a monitor and they're basically what we would consider a vegetable, they're still conscious. If we could have them communicate, we would have so many more answers. There are so many answers that just lie before us, waiting for somebody to unearth them. And I think that together we might be able to do this.